In the heart of ancient Egypt's most sacred burial ground, when the blazing desert sun finally surrendered to the cool embrace of night, a different kind of work began. As the last echoes of hammers and chisels faded from the limestone corridors, the Valley of the Kings transformed into a realm of shadows and whispered vigilance. This is the story of the men who walked through that darkness, the night watchmen whose silent footsteps traced paths between the tombs of pharaohs, whose keen eyes searched the starlit landscape for any sign of disturbance, and whose unwavering dedication protected the most precious secrets of the ancient world. The Valley of the Kings was far more than a burial ground. It was a vast construction site where hundreds of skilled workers labored for decades to create the elaborate underground palaces that would serve as eternal homes for Egypt's divine rulers. Each tomb was carved deep into the living rock and decorated with the most sophisticated religious art the world had ever seen. But this great work faced constant threats. The very treasures that made the tombs fit for Pharaoh's gold, silver, precious stones, and priceless artifacts also made them irresistible targets for those desperate enough to risk the severe penalties for tomb robbery. Professional criminals and even desperate workers posed ongoing dangers to the security of the royal burial sites. It was the night watchman who stood between these threats and the sacred tombs, working in the hours when legitimate construction activity ceased. They became the final line of defense for projects that represented not just immense material value, but the very foundation of Egyptian beliefs about kingship, death, and the afterlife. These were not simple guards, but skilled professionals who had developed sophisticated techniques for moving silently through treacherous terrain, detecting threats in complete darkness, and responding effectively to any disturbance of the sacred sites. They possessed intimate knowledge of the valley's geography, understanding how sounds carried in the desert air, and how shadows fell across the rocky landscape at different times of night. Tonight, we will walk with one of these forgotten guardians through the quiet hours of his watch. This is the story of Amenhotep, a night watchman who served during the reign of Ramesses IX, when the great age of tomb building was drawing to a close, but the need for vigilant protection remained as critical as ever. Through his eyes, we will discover the hidden world of the valley's nighttime guardians, learning how they moved through the darkness, what they watched for, and how their quiet dedication helped preserve one of humanity's greatest archaeological treasures. So settle back and prepare to journey into the peaceful darkness of ancient Egypt, where ordinary men performed extraordinary service in protection of their civilization's most sacred beliefs. In the pre-dawn darkness of the Valley of the Kings, when the last stars still flickered against the deep purple sky, a solitary figure moved slowly along the rocky paths between tomb entrances. His sandaled feet made barely a whisper against the limestone dust, and the only sounds that accompanied him were the distant call of a night bird and the gentle rustle of his linen tunic in the cool desert breeze. This was Amenhotep, a night watchman whose duty it was to guard the sacred tombs under construction in this most hallowed of burial grounds. For nearly 2 decades, he had walked these same paths, his presence as constant and reliable as the passage of the stars overhead. The valley knew him, and he knew every shadow, every sound, every subtle change that the night might bring. The Valley of the Kings, nestled in the hills west of ancient Thebes, had been chosen by the pharaohs of the New Kingdom as their eternal resting place. Unlike the towering pyramids of earlier dynasties, these tombs were carved deep into the living rock, hidden from view and protected by the very mountains themselves. But even in this remote and sacred place, the threat of tomb robbers was ever present, making the role of the night watchman essential to preserving the pharaoh's journey to the afterlife. As Amenhotep continued his slow patrol, he paused at the entrance to the tomb of Ramesses VII, where work had been progressing for the past 3 years. The entrance, partially concealed by carefully arranged stones and debris, showed no signs of disturbance. He crouched down, his experienced eyes scanning the ground for any footprints that didn't belong, any moved stones, any indication that unauthorized visitors had come in the night. The work on this tomb, like all the royal tombs, followed ancient traditions passed down through generations of craftsmen. During the day, teams of skilled artisans descended into the tunnels with their tools and pigments, slowly carving and painting the elaborate scenes that would guide the pharaoh through the underworld. But when darkness fell, their work ceased, and the responsibility for protecting these sacred spaces fell to men like Amenhotep. The night watchman carried with him the tools of his trade, a simple wooden staff, worn smooth by years of handling, a small oil lamp made of pottery, its flame dancing gently in its clay reservoir, and a leather pouch containing dried dates and barley bread for sustenance during the long hours of darkness. His clothing was practical rather than ornater, knee-length tunic of undyed linen, a leather belt, and sturdy sandals that could navigate the rocky terrain in silence. As he moved from tomb to tomb, Amenhotep's trained ear caught every sound that the night offered. The soft scurrying of a small desert mouse among the rocks posed no threat, nor did the distant howl of a jackal echoing from the hills. These were the familiar sounds of the valley's nighttime world. What he listened for were the sounds that didn't belong, the muffled conversation of approaching figures, the scrape of metal against stone, the cautious footsteps of those who had no right to be in this sacred place. The pharaohs understood well the value of such vigilance. The tombs under construction contained not only the future burial chambers of divine kings, but also the workshops where precious grave goods were being prepared. Golden jewelry, elaborate furniture, ceremonial weapons, and countless other treasures lay within these tunnels, making them attractive targets for those bold enough to risk the severe punishments that awaited tomb robbers. Amenhotep's father had been a night watchman before him, and his grandfather before that. The knowledge of how to read the desert night, how to move silently through the valley, and how to distinguish between harmless night sounds and genuine threats had been passed down through his family like a sacred trust. He had learned as a boy to identify the different calls of night birds, to know which sounds carried farther in the dry air and which were absorbed by the rocky walls of the valley. The lamp he carried was designed specifically for his work. Its flame was steady, but not bright, providing just enough light to illuminate his immediate surroundings without creating a beacon that could be seen from a distance. The oil was mixed with aromatic resins that burned cleanly and slowly, ensuring that the light would last through the entire night. When the lamp needed to be refilled, Amenhotep would retreat to a small shelter carved into the rock face, where supplies were kept hidden from view. As the night deepened and the temperature dropped, Amenhotep pulled his woolen cloak more tightly around his shoulders. The desert, which blazed with heat during the day, could become surprisingly cold in the hours before dawn. This daily transformation of the valley was something he had witnessed thousands of times, yet it never ceased to fill him with a quiet sense of wonder. The same rocks that radiated heat during the day now released their stored warmth slowly into the cooling air, creating gentle currents that stirred the dust and carried the faint scent of distant vegetation. The tomb he approached next was that of Ramesses IX, a more recent project where the initial cutting had been completed and the artists had begun their delicate work of decoration. Amenhotep descended carefully down the sloping entrance, his footsteps echoing softly in the narrow corridor. The walls here were already beginning to show the magnificent artwork that would eventually cover every surface scenes from the Book of the Dead, images of gods and goddesses, and the hieroglyphic texts that would ensure the pharaoh's safe passage through the dangers of the underworld. In the flickering light of his lamp, these painted figures seemed almost alive, their eyes following his movements as he passed. The artists had captured not just the appearance of the divine beings, but something of their eternal nature as well. Amenhotep had grown accustomed to these silent companions during his nightly rounds, finding comfort rather than fear in their presence. They were, after all, guardians like himself, protecting the pharaoh's eternal rest. At the deepest part of the tomb, where the burial chamber would eventually house the pharaoh's sarcophagus, Amenhotep paused to listen. The silence here was profound, broken only by the soft whisper of air moving through the tunnels. This was the heart of the tomb, the most sacred space, and it demanded a moment of reverence from all who entered. Even the workers, during their daily labors, would pause here to offer a quiet prayer before beginning their tasks. The construction of these tombs was a race against time, for no one could predict when a pharaoh might die and require immediate burial. Teams of workers labored in shifts, some during the day and others during the cooler evening hours, but never through the entire night. The darkness belonged to the watchmen and to the spirits of the valley, and this ancient understanding was respected by all. Emerging from the tomb, Amenhotep continued his patrol along the winding path that connected all the active construction sites. His route was carefully planned to provide maximum coverage, while allowing him to respond quickly to any disturbance. He knew exactly how long it took to walk from one end of his territory to the other, and he could judge the passage of time by the position of the stars overhead. The constellation of Orion, which the Egyptians knew as Osiris, was beginning its slow descent toward the western horizon. This celestial timekeeper told Amenhotep that the night was advancing toward its deepest hour, the time when tomb robbers were most likely to make their move. It was during these darkest hours that his vigilance was most crucial, when every shadow might conceal a threat and every sound required careful investigation. As he walked, Amenhotep reflected on the responsibility that had been entrusted to him. The pharaohs were not merely kings, but living gods, divine beings whose proper burial and eternal rest were essential to the continued prosperity of Egypt. The tombs he guarded were not just burial places, but sacred temples, where the transformation from earthly ruler to eternal deity would take place. To fail in his duty would be not just a professional failure, but a betrayal of the divine order itself. The night air carried the faint scent of burning charcoal from the distant workers' village, where the families of the tomb builders lived. Even at this hour, a few fires would be burning low, providing warmth for sleeping children and the elderly. Amenhotep could sometimes see the faintest glow from these fires, reflecting off the clouds, a reminder that he was not entirely alone in the darkness, that his vigil was part of a larger community dedicated to serving the pharaohs. A gentle breeze stirred the dust at his feet, and Amenhotep paused to let it pass. Such moments of stillness were precious during his long nights, opportunities to center himself and renew his focus. The desert wind seemed to carry with it the wisdom of ages, the accumulated experience of all the watchmen who had walked these paths before him, and he drew strength from this connection to the past. As the first chapter of his nightly journey drew to a close, Amenhotep made his way to the highest point in his patrol route, a rocky outcrop that provided a clear view of the entire valley. From here, he could see the entrances to all the active tomb sites, their locations marked by the careful arrangement of stones and the nearly invisible paths that led to each entrance. The valley spread below him, a vast open book, its secrets written in stone and shadow, and he was its most faithful reader. The Valley of the Kings at night revealed secrets that the harsh daylight obscured. As Amenhotep settled into his watchful position on the rocky overlook, he surveyed the landscape that had become as familiar to him as the lines on his own weathered hands. Each shadow, each outcropping of stone, each subtle depression in the valley floor held meaning and memory, accumulated over years of patient observation. The valley was shaped like a great amphitheater, carved by ancient waters and sculpted by countless seasons of wind and rare but powerful floods. Its walls rose steeply on all sides, creating a natural fortress that had made it attractive to the pharaohs as a burial ground. But these same walls that provided protection during the day became a maze of shadows and acoustic chambers at night, where sounds bounced and echoed in ways that could confuse the unwary. Amenhotep understood this nighttime geography intimately. He knew that voices carried differently depending on where they originated. A whispered conversation near the tomb of Thutmose III would reach him clearly on his perch, while louder talk from the entrance to Ramesses IV's tomb would be muffled by the intervening rock formations. This acoustic map of the valley was as important to his work as any physical landmark. The limestone cliffs that enclosed the valley were layered in bands of different colors and textures, each representing millions of years of geological history. During the day, these layers were clearly visible, ranging from pale cream to deep gold, but at night they merged into a palette of grays and deep blues. The rock faces caught and held the day's heat, releasing it slowly through the night hours, creating subtle temperature variations that affected how sounds traveled and how the air moved through the valley. Water, though rare in this desert landscape, had played a crucial role in shaping the valley's character. Ancient flash floods had carved the main wadi, the dry riverbed that formed the valley's floor, and smaller tributaries had created the side valleys where many of the most important tombs were located. These waterways, dry for most of the year, became channels for sound at night, carrying whispers and footsteps much farther than they would travel across open ground. Amenhotep had learned to read these subtle currents of air and sound like a sailor reads the wind. On still nights, when the air lay motionless in the valley's depths, even the smallest sounds seemed amplified. The scratch of a beetle's claws against stone, the distant call of a night-hunting fox, the soft footfall of another watchman making his rounds, all of these reached his ears with startling clarity. But when the wind was blowing, as it often did in the hours before dawn, the valley became a different place entirely. The moving air created its own symphony of sounds as it flowed around rock formations, through narrow passages, and across the entrances to tombs. On such nights, Amenhotep had to rely more heavily on his eyes, watching for the flicker of an authorized light or the movement of shadows where no movement should be. The paths through the valley had been worn by centuries of use, first by the ancient Egyptians who had selected and prepared the burial sites, then by the workers who had carved and decorated the tombs, and finally by countless generations of priests, guards, and maintainers who had kept the sacred sites secure. These paths were not straight or direct, but followed the natural contours of the land, winding around obstacles and taking advantage of stable footing. At night, these familiar paths took on new characteristics. What was a clear walkway in daylight might become treacherous in darkness, where loose stones could turn underfoot or hidden depressions could catch an unwary ankle. Amenhotep's sandals were specially made for this terrain, with thick leather sawless that provided both protection and sensitivity, allowing him to feel the path beneath his feet even when his eyes were focused on the shadows ahead. The entrance to each tomb was carefully concealed, not just from potential robbers, but from the casual observer as well. The ancient builders had gone to great lengths to make their work sites blend into the natural landscape, using techniques that were as much art as engineering. Piles of excavated limestone were arranged to look like natural rock falls. Pathways were designed to appear as accidental animal tracks, and the actual doorways were often hidden behind carefully constructed false walls. For Amenhotep, these concealed entrances were landmarks as clear as any monument. He could identify each one not just by its location, but by the subtle signs that marked it, the particular way the stones were arranged, the specific angle at which the entrance faced, the small markers left by the construction crews to identify their work sites. This knowledge had been passed down to him by his predecessors and would, in time, be passed on to whoever followed him in this sacred duty. The tomb of Amenhotep II, one of the older excavations in the valley, occupied a particularly significant position in the nighttime landscape. Its entrance, cut into a natural depression in the valley floor, was almost invisible during the day, but became a pool of deeper shadow at night. The acoustic properties of this location were remarkable. Sounds from within the tomb hurried clearly to the surface, while conversations near the entrance seemed to be absorbed by the surrounding rock. Moving eastward along his route, Amenhotep passed the site where work had recently begun on what would become the tomb of Ramesses XI. Here, the excavation was still in its early stages, with only a few meters of corridor carved into the rock. The fresh limestone chips that surrounded the entrance gleamed pale in the starlight, and the smell of newly cut stone still lingered in the air around the worksite. Each active construction site had its own rhythm and character at night. Some, like the deep tombs that had been under construction for years, seemed to breathe with their own internal life, the air currents moving in and out of the passages, creating subtle sounds and temperature changes. Others, particularly the newer excavations, felt raw and unfinished, their brief corridors ending abruptly in working faces where the next day's labor would continue. The presence of the construction work also meant that tools and materials were cached at various locations throughout the valley. Bronze chisels and wooden mallets were stored in carefully concealed locations, protected from both theft and the damaging effects of the desert's temperature extremes. Pigments and binding agents used by the artists were kept in sealed containers, hidden in natural cracks and crevices. These supply caches were known only to the work crews and the watchmen, their locations forming another layer of the valley's secret geography. Amenhotep's knowledge extended beyond the immediate construction sites to the broader network of paths, shelters, and resources that supported the tomb-building enterprise. He knew where fresh water could be found in sealed jars hidden among the rocks, where emergency supplies of food were cached for workers caught by unexpected delays, and where the small shrines and offerings to protective deities were maintained by the pious among the work crews. The stars overhead provided another layer of geographic reference for the night watchman. The ancient Egyptians were accomplished astronomers, and their celestial knowledge was both practical and religious. Certain stars and constellations were associated with specific deities and were believed to influence the success of the tomb construction work. Amenhotep had learned to read these star patterns not just as a way of telling time, but as indicators of divine favor or concern. The constellation of the Great Bear, which never set below the horizon, was particularly significant in Egyptian astronomy. known as the imperishable ones. These stars were associated with eternal life and the pharaoh's journey through the afterworld. Their position in the sky could tell Amenhotep not only the time of night, but also the season of the year and the approaching of important religious festivals that might affect the work schedule. As the night progressed and the stars wheeled slowly overhead, the valley's temperature continued to drop. The limestone cliffs, which had absorbed the fierce heat of the day, gradually released their stored warmth into the cooling air. This thermal process created gentle air currents that flowed down the valley walls and pooled in the lowest areas, carrying with them the accumulated scents of the day dust and stone, the faint traces of incense from distant temples, and occasionally the lingering aroma of the resins and oils used in the tomb construction work. The cooling air also brought changes in humidity, subtle but noticeable to someone with Amenhotep's experience. On some nights, the air would become noticeably drier, causing wood to contract with tiny creaking sounds and making fabrics rustle more crisply. On others, particularly when winds brought moisture from the distant Nile, the air would carry a softness that seemed to muffle sounds and blur the sharp edges of shadows. These environmental changes were more than just background conditions. For Amenhotep's work, they were active factors that influenced how he conducted his patrols. On dry nights, he had to be more careful about creating dust clouds that might be visible to distant observers. On humid nights, he could move more quickly along his routes, knowing that the softer air would help conceal the sounds of his passage. The relationship between the valley and the broader landscape beyond its walls was also part of Amenhotep's mental geography. To the east lay the Nile River and the city of Thebes, sources of both support and potential threat. Legitimate visitors to the valley would approach from this direction, following established paths that Amenhotep knew well. But tomb robbers might also come from this direction, using their knowledge of the area's geography to plan their approach and escape routes. To the west, the valley opened toward the broader desert and the network of wadis and rocky highlands that stretched toward the Red Sea. This was rougher country, less well-traveled, but offering numerous hiding places and alternative routes for those who knew how to navigate the harsh terrain. The western approaches to the valley were more difficult to guard, requiring careful attention to the subtle signs that might indicate the presence of intruders approaching from unexpected directions. As his second chapter of the night's patrol drew to a close, Amenhotep paused at the entrance to the tomb of Seti I, one of the most ambitious construction projects currently underway in the valley. This tomb, when completed, would be the longest and most elaborately decorated in the entire necropolis, requiring years of careful work by the most skilled artisans available. Standing before its concealed entrance in the quiet darkness, he reflected on the magnitude of the responsibility that he and his fellow watchmen carried, not just protecting valuable objects, but safeguarding the eternal rest of the divine kings and ensuring the continued prosperity of Egypt itself. The art of maintaining vigilance through the long desert night had been refined over generations of watchmen, each adding his own understanding to the accumulated wisdom of those who had walked these paths before. Amenhotep's patrol followed a carefully established rhythm, a pattern of movement and observation that maximized his effectiveness while conserving his strength for the hours of darkness that stretched ahead. His route began each night at the small stone shelter that served as the watchman's headquarters, a modest structure built into a natural depression in the valley wall, where it was both concealed from casual observation and positioned to provide a commanding view of the main approaches to the tomb sites. Here, as darkness settled over the valley, Amenhotep would begin his preparations with the methodical care of a ritual. First came the lighting of his patrol lamp, a process that required patience and skill. The wick, made from twisted linen fibers, had to be trimmed to exactly the right length to provide steady light without producing excessive smoke. The oil, a mixture of sesame oil and rendered animal fat, was poured carefully into the lamp's reservoir, leaving just enough air space to prevent spillage during movement. A pinch of ground frankincense added to the oil would help mask any human scent that might alert potential intruders to his presence. The lamp's flame, once established, became his constant companion throughout the night. Its warm yellow glow created a small circle of visibility around him, pushing back the darkness just far enough to reveal the immediate path ahead, while leaving him largely invisible to distant observers. The art lay in using this light effectively, knowing when to shield it with his body to avoid detection, when to hold it high to illuminate suspicious shadows, and when to extinguish it entirely if stealth was required. His first circuit of the patrol route took him past each of the active tomb sites in a predetermined order, a sequence designed to provide complete coverage while minimizing the predictability of his movements. The path wound from the headquarters shelter down to the valley floor, then followed the main wadi eastward past the oldest tomb sites before turning south toward the more recent excavations. At each tomb entrance, Amenhotep followed the same careful procedure. He would approach slowly, listening for any sounds from within the tunnels that might indicate unauthorized activity. The sealed entrances were inspected for signs of tampering, moved stones, fresh footprints in the dust, any disturbance of the carefully arranged debris that concealed each doorway. If the entrance appeared secure, he would move close enough to listen at the sealed opening, his ear pressed against the stone, detecting any sounds of movement from the tunnels beyond. The tombs themselves had acoustic properties that made this listening technique remarkably effective. Sound traveled well through the stone corridors, and even quiet conversation or the scrape of tools against rock would carry to the surface. Amenhotep had learned to distinguish between the innocent sounds of the tomb's natural settling, the tiny creaks and sighs that stone makes as it adjusts to temperature changes, and the deliberate sounds made by human activity. Some tombs required more extensive inspection than others. The deeper excavations, with their complex networks of corridors and chambers, offered numerous hiding places where intruders might conceal themselves during the day, emerging only at night to continue their illegal work. These sites demanded careful exploration, with Amenhotep sometimes descending into the tunnels themselves, his lamp casting dancing shadows on the painted walls as he made his way through passages that twisted deep into the living rock. The tomb of Ramesses II, though not currently under active construction, required particular attention because of its significance and the valuable materials known to be stored within. This massive excavation, with its elaborate decorations and multiple chambers, was a prime target for tomb robbers who understood the wealth it would eventually contain. Amenhotep's inspection of this site was thorough and methodical, checking not only the main entrance, but also the smaller openings that provided ventilation for the deep chambers. Movement between the tomb sites required its own specialized techniques. The valley's rocky terrain was treacherous enough in daylight. At night, it demanded constant attention and careful foot placement. Amenhotep had developed a particular way of walking that minimized both noise and the risk of injury, a measured pace that allowed him to test each step before committing his full weight to it, while keeping his center of gravity low and stable. His sandals were specially adapted for this night work. The leather soles were treated with rendered fat to keep them supple and quiet, while additional strips of soft hide wrapped around the foot provided extra grip on smooth stone surfaces. The fastenings were secured with extra care to prevent any loose straps from catching on rocks or creating unwanted noise. The wooden staff that Amenhotep carried served multiple purposes beyond its obvious function as a weapon. Its primary use was as a walking aid and probe, testing the stability of questionable footing and detecting obstacles in the darkness ahead. The staff's length about as tall as a man's shoulder made it ideal for checking the depth of shadows or the stability of rock piles that might conceal hidden entrances, but the staff also served as a tool for listening. Placed against a rock wall or the sealed entrance to a tomb, it could amplify subtle sounds and vibrations, allowing Amenhotep to detect activity that might otherwise escape notice. The wood itself was chosen for this purpose, a dense hardwood that transmitted vibrations well, while remaining light enough for comfortable handling during long hours of patrol. Water discipline was crucial during the night watches. The desert air, even at night, drew moisture from the body steadily, and dehydration could impair judgment and reaction time. Amenhotep carried a small leather water bag, carefully rationed to last through the entire night, while providing adequate hydration. The water itself was precious, drawn from wells near the workers' village and flavored with mint to make it more refreshing and to help mask the taste of the leather container. Food during the patrol was limited to items that could be eaten quietly and wouldn't leave traces that might attract scavengers. Dried dates provided quick energy, while barley cakes offered more substantial nutrition. These foods were wrapped in clean linen and carried in a leather pouch that was secured to prevent rustling or the escape of food odors that might attract unwanted animal attention. The timing of the patrol circuits was carefully calculated to provide optimal coverage while allowing for thorough inspection of each site. The complete route took approximately 2 hours to traverse at the measured pace required for proper vigilance, meaning that each location was visited roughly 3 times during the course of a typical night. This frequency was sufficient to detect most unauthorized activity, while allowing enough time for detailed inspection when suspicious signs were discovered. Rest periods were built into the patrol schedule, brief stops at predetermined locations where Amenhotep could sit quietly and observe the valley from different vantage points. These rest stops served multiple purposes. They provided necessary relief for tired legs and feet. They allowed time for careful listening without the sound of his own movement, and they created irregular patterns in his movement that made it difficult for potential intruders to predict his location at any given time. The most important rest stop was at the high overlook position, where a natural shelf in the valley wall provided both concealment and an excellent view of the entire tomb complex. Here, Amenhotep would extinguish his lamp and sit in complete darkness, allowing his eyes to adjust fully to the night vision that artificial light would otherwise compromise. From this position, he could detect the glow of unauthorized torches or lamps anywhere in the valley, while remaining completely invisible himself. During these periods of motionless observation, other senses became more acute. The subtle sounds of the desert night, the distant call of hunting foxes, the rustle of small creatures moving through the sparse vegetation, the almost inaudible whisper of wind through rock crevices provided a constant background against which any human-made sound would stand out clearly. The desert's own rhythms also influenced the patrol schedule. Certain times of night were more likely to see tomb or activity, typically the deepest hours of darkness when most honest people would be asleep, but not so late that the approaching dawn would threaten to trap intruders in the valley. Amenhotep adjusted his patrol timing to ensure maximum coverage during these high-risk periods. Weather conditions also affected the patrol routine. On clear nights with good visibility, he could cover his route more quickly and spend additional time on detailed inspections. During the occasional sandstorms that swept through the region, patrol became more difficult, but also more important, since the reduced visibility and masking noise provided cover for potential intruders. The rare nights when rain fell in the valley created unique challenges and opportunities. Rain would wash away tracks and disturb the careful arrangements of stone and debris that concealed tomb entrances, requiring more thorough inspection the following night. But rain also created new tracks in the mud, making it easier to detect unauthorized visits that might otherwise leave no trace. Temperature changes throughout the night required adjustments to both clothing and patrol techniques. The early evening hours, while cooler than the blazing day, still retained enough heat to make rapid movement uncomfortable. But as the night progressed and temperatures dropped, the risk of becoming chilled during the motionless periods of observation required careful management of his woolen cloak. The physical demands of the night patrol were considerable, but they were matched by the mental challenges of maintaining alertness and focus through long hours of darkness. Amenhotep had developed techniques for staying mentally sharp, varying his route slightly each night to prevent the dulling effect of routine, actively searching for changes in the familiar landscape, and periodically testing his memory by mentally cataloguing all the significant features he had observed during his patrol. Interactions with other watchmen were limited but important. The valley's guard force was small, with each man responsible for a specific sector, but their routes occasionally intersected at predetermined checkpoints. These brief meetings served both as security measures confirming that all guards were at their posts and alert, and as opportunities to share information about unusual observations or potential threats. As the third chapter of his night's work drew to a close, Amenhotep found himself at the southernmost point of his patrol route, near the entrance to the tomb of Ramesses IX. Here, the valley's walls rose especially steep and high, creating a natural fortress that had attracted the ancient tomb builders, but also created complex patterns of shadow and echo that demanded extra vigilance from the night watchmen who protected these sacred sites. The construction sites scattered throughout the Valley of the Kings were far more than simple excavations. They were complex, carefully organized workplaces that continued to function even in the darkness, though their activity shifted from active labor to protective vigilance. Understanding the intricate layout and organization of these sites was essential to Amenhotep's effectiveness as a night watchman, for each tomb project created its own unique landscape of opportunities and vulnerabilities. The tomb of Seti I, currently the most ambitious project in the valley, exemplified the complexity of these royal burial preparations. The main entrance, carved into a natural slope in the valley wall, was concealed behind an elaborate screen of loose stones and debris that appeared completely natural to the casual observer. But this concealment was just the beginning of a sophisticated security system that extended deep into the bedrock. The entrance corridor, already carved to a depth of nearly 30 meters, descended at a carefully calculated angle that would eventually lead to chambers situated far below the valley floor. This sloping passage was designed not just for ceremonial purposes, but also for practical security. Its length and angle made it impossible for intruders to see into the deeper chambers from the entrance, while the downward slope created acoustic effects that would carry sounds upward to alert guards positioned at the surface. Work platforms and staging areas had been carved into the corridor walls at regular intervals, providing spaces where artisans could store their materials and tools during active construction periods. At night, these platforms served a different purpose, becoming listening posts where watchmen could detect sounds from deeper in the tunnel system. The platforms were positioned with acoustic considerations in mind, each one located at points where the tunnel's geometry would amplify sounds from the working faces below. The storage of construction materials presented ongoing security challenges that Amenhotep had to address during his patrols. Bronze tools, essential for the precise carving work required in tomb construction, were valuable enough to attract thieves even without considering the tomb's ultimate treasures. These implements were secured each night in wooden chests that were themselves hidden within false chambers carved specifically for storage purposes. The pigments and binding agents used by the tomb artists were even more valuable than the bronze tools and considerably more portable. Gold leaf, lapis lazuli powder, and the precious minerals that created the vivid colors adorning the tomb walls were stored in sealed pottery jars, hidden in locations known only to the master artisans and the night watchmen. Amenhotep's route included regular checks of these cache locations, ensuring that the carefully arranged concealment remained undisturbed. Lighting for the construction work created its own security considerations. During active work periods, oil lamps and torches illuminated the tomb interiors, but these light sources had to be carefully managed to prevent both fire hazards and the attraction of unwanted attention. At night, all artificial lighting was extinguished except for the small lamps carried by the watchmen themselves, creating a careful balance between security needs and the practical requirements of nighttime patrol. The ventilation systems carved into each tomb were marvels of ancient engineering, but they also represented potential security vulnerabilities. These carefully designed air shafts ensured that workers could breathe safely in the deep tunnels, but they also provided alternative access routes that tomb robbers might attempt to exploit. Amenhotep's inspection routine included checking these ventilation openings, many of which were concealed among the natural rock formations of the valley walls. Some of the air shafts were large enough to admit a determined intruder, making them particular points of concern. These openings were secured with bronze grates or stone covers, but the fastenings had to be checked regularly for signs of tampering. The shafts also served as conduits for sound, meaning that activity within the tombs could sometimes be detected by listening at the ventilation openings rather than at the main entrances. The workshop areas associated with each major tomb were complex installations in their own right. These surface facilities, carefully concealed among the valley's natural rock formations, housed the specialized equipment needed for tomb construction and decoration. Stone-cutting tools, measuring instruments, artists' equipment, and the furnaces used for heating bronze implements were all part of the infrastructure that supported the underground work. At night, these workshop areas required particular attention from the patrolling watchmen. The tools and materials stored here were valuable, but more importantly, disturbance of these facilities could seriously disrupt the tomb construction schedule. A delay in completing a royal tomb could have political and religious consequences that extended far beyond the immediate construction project. The water management systems serving the construction sites were another element of the infrastructure that Amenhotep had to monitor. Fresh water was essential for mixing plaster, cleaning stone surfaces, and supporting the workers during their lengthy shifts in the hot, dry tunnels. This water was stored in large pottery jars, positioned at strategic locations throughout the valley, often concealed in natural depressions or artificial hiding places carved into the rock. The water storage locations were carefully chosen, not just for convenience, but also for security. The jars were heavy and difficult to move, making them unattractive to casual thieves, but they were positioned where authorized workers could access them easily while remaining hidden from unauthorized observers. Amenhotep's patrol route included regular checks of these water caches, both to ensure security and to verify that the seals on the storage jars remained intact. Waste management from the construction sites created its own challenges and opportunities for security. The limestone chips and dust generated by the excavation work had to be removed from the tomb sites and disposed of in ways that wouldn't reveal the locations or progress of the construction work. This excavated material was carefully spread across the valley floor and arranged to blend with the natural rock debris, a process that required considerable skill and attention to detail. The waste disposal areas, while appearing completely natural, were actually carefully engineered to serve security purposes as well as practical ones. The arranged stones and debris provided concealment for supply caches, hiding places for emergency equipment, and observation posts for the watchman. Amenhotep knew which of these apparently random rock piles were actually strategic positions in the valley's defensive network. The construction schedule itself influenced the security requirements at each tomb site. Projects in their early stages, with only shallow entrance corridors completed, required different protection strategies than the deeper, more advanced excavations. New sites were vulnerable primarily to vandalism or the theft of construction materials, while the mature projects with their elaborate decorations and stored burial goods represented much more valuable targets. The timing of construction work also created predictable patterns that potential tomb robbers might attempt to exploit. Work crews followed regular schedules, arriving at dawn and departing well before sunset to avoid the dangerous heat of the desert afternoon. This predictability meant that the sites were unoccupied and vulnerable during the same hours each day, making the night watch even more critical to the overall security strategy. Communication between the various tomb sites was maintained through a system of signals and messengers that operated even during the night hours. Watchmen carried bronze mirrors that could reflect lamplight or starlight to send simple coded messages across the valley. These signals were used sparingly to avoid attracting unwanted attention, but they provided a means for coordinating responses to threats or sharing information about suspicious activity. The signal system was based on a simple code that all watchmen had memorized: single flashes for routine status reports, double flashes to indicate the need for assistance, and a series of rapid flashes to warn of immediate danger. The mirrors were small enough to conceal easily, but large enough to cast visible reflections across the considerable distances that separated the guard posts throughout the valley. Emergency procedures were well established and regularly rehearsed, though hopefully never needed in actual practice. If a tomb robber was discovered in the act, the watchman who made the discovery would attempt to apprehend the intruder if possible, but would prioritize raising the alarm to summon assistance from other guards and, if necessary, from the security forces stationed in the workers' village beyond the valley. The penalties for tomb robbery were severe enough to serve as significant deterrents, but the value of the treasures being protected was equally significant in attracting the attention of desperate or greedy individuals. The balance between these opposing forces meant that vigilance could never be relaxed, and that even the most routine patrol had to be conducted with the assumption that tonight might be the night when real danger presented itself. As Amenhotep completed his inspection of the Seti I construction site, he reflected on the remarkable sophistication of the security systems that protected these sacred projects. Every aspect of the tomb construction process had been designed with security in mind, from the initial selection of sites to the daily management of work crews. The night watchmen were just one element in this comprehensive approach, but they were perhaps the most critical element, serving as the final line of defense during the vulnerable hours of darkness. The men who served as night watchmen in the Valley of the Kings formed a unique brotherhood, bound together not only by their shared duties, but by the profound responsibility they carried as guardians of Egypt's most sacred sites. This brotherhood had its own traditions, its own knowledge, and its own unwritten codes of conduct that had been passed down through generations of faithful service. Amenhotep's father, Keti, had served as a night watchman before him, and many evenings of his childhood had been spent listening to stories of the valley's mysteries and dangers. These were not tales told for entertainment, but serious instruction in the skills and knowledge that would be essential if he chose to follow in his father's footsteps. The older man had spoken of nights when tomb robbers had actually been encountered, of the techniques used to approach suspicious activity without alerting the intruders, and of the courage required to confront armed and desperate criminals in the darkness. The selection of new watchmen was a careful process that involved not just an assessment of physical capabilities, but also of character and reliability. The men chosen for this responsibility had to demonstrate not only courage and alertness, but also the discretion to keep the secrets they would inevitably learn about tomb locations, security procedures, and the valuable materials stored within the construction sites. Training for new watchmen began with months of daytime patrols, learning the geography of the valley and the specific vulnerabilities of each tomb site. Experienced watchmen like Amenhotep served as mentors, sharing the accumulated wisdom of years of night patrol and teaching the subtle skills that could not be learned from instruction alone. The ability to move silently across rocky terrain, to distinguish between innocent night sounds and potential threats, and to remain alert during long hours of darkness were all skills that required practice and patience to develop. The watchmen developed their own specialized vocabulary for describing the various aspects of their work. Particular types of shadows had specific names, different qualities of silence were distinguished by subtle terms, and the various sounds that the valley made during the night were categorized with a precision that would seem excessive to outsiders, but was essential for clear communication among the guards. Each watchman carried certain standard equipment, but individual variations reflected both personal preferences and the specific requirements of different patrol routes. Amenhotep's wooden staff, for example, was carved with small notches that served as tactile references in complete darkness, allowing him to judge distances and positions even when his lamp was extinguished for stealth. Other watchmen preferred different approaches. Some carried longer staffs, better suited for probing suspicious shadows, while others favored shorter, more maneuverable weapons. The oil lamps used by the watchmen were similarly individualized. While all followed the same basic design principles, each man had his own preferences for wick material, oil mixtures, and the addition of aromatic substances that helped mask human scent. Some watchmen added powdered myrrh to their lamp oil, believing that the sacred fragrance would provide protection from malevolent spirits as well as practical concealment. Others preferred simpler mixtures that burned more cleanly and produced less telltale smoke. Communication among the watchmen extended beyond the formal signal systems to include a variety of informal methods for sharing information and coordinating activities. Small marks scratched into rocks at strategic locations could convey simple messages about patrol timing, unusual observations, or changes in security procedures. These marks were made with bronze styluses and were designed to appear as natural scratches to the casual observer, while remaining clearly readable to those who knew the system. The placement of small stones or other natural objects in predetermined patterns provided another method of communication. A stone moves slightly from its usual position indicate that a particular area required extra attention, while a specific arrangement of pebbles could warn other watchmen about potential dangers or changes in the patrol schedule. These subtle signals were particularly useful because they could be left in place for extended periods and would appear completely innocent to anyone who didn't understand their significance. Rest periods during the long night shifts were coordinated among the various watchmen to ensure that the valley never lacked adequate coverage. While one guard might pause for a brief rest or meal, others would adjust their patrol routes to provide overlapping coverage of the temporarily unguarded areas. This coordination required careful timing and mutual trust, as each watchman had to rely on his colleagues to fulfill their responsibilities while he attended to his own needs. The seasonal variations in night length required adjustments to patrol schedules and coordination protocols. During the short nights of summer, the watchman could maintain more intensive coverage with frequent patrols of all areas. But during the long winter nights, the same number of guards had to provide protection for extended periods, requiring more careful planning and more efficient use of available manpower. Weather conditions created additional challenges that the watchman had learned to address through cooperative strategies. During sandstorms, when visibility was severely reduced and normal patrol routes became dangerous, the guards would concentrate their efforts on protecting the most critical sites, while maintaining communication through sound signals that could penetrate the howling wind. The rare occasions when rain fell in the valley brought their own unique requirements for cooperation. Rain would erase tracks and disturb the careful arrangements that concealed tomb entrances, requiring systematic re-inspection of all sites once the weather cleared. This work was too extensive for individual watchmen to handle alone, so temporary partnerships would be formed to ensure thorough coverage of the affected areas. Knowledge sharing among the watchmen extended to detailed understanding of the valley's wildlife and how animal behavior could provide early warning of human intrusion. The guards had learned to recognize the normal patterns of movement among the desert foxes, the flight patterns of night-hunting birds, and the behavior of the various small creatures that made their homes among the valley's rocks and crevices. When these normal patterns were disrupted, it often indicated the presence of intruders well before any human activity could be directly observed. A fox that fled from its usual hunting ground, birds that suddenly fell silent, or the agitated behavior of normally placid lizards could all serve as early warning signs that required investigation. The watchman had also developed considerable expertise in reading tracks and signs left by both animals and humans. Footprints in dust, disturbed vegetation, marks on rock surfaces, and even subtle changes in scent could all provide information about who or what had passed through an area and when. This knowledge was shared freely among the guards, with more experienced men teaching younger colleagues how to distinguish between significant signs and meaningless coincidences. The psychological challenges of night watch duty were addressed through informal support systems among the watchmen. The long hours of darkness, the constant need for alertness, and the isolation of individual patrol routes could create considerable stress, particularly for newer guards. Experienced watchmen like Amenhotep took responsibility for mentoring their colleagues, sharing techniques for maintaining mental sharpness, and dealing with the fear and anxiety that naturally arose from solitary duty in dangerous circumstances. Stories and legends about the valley and its protectors served multiple purposes within the Watchman's Brotherhood. These tales, some based on historical events and others purely mythical, helped maintain morale and foster a sense of connection to the long tradition of guards who had served before. They also served as vehicles for transmitting practical knowledge, with important lessons about security procedures and threat recognition embedded within entertaining narratives. The relationship between the night watchmen and the day shift workers was carefully managed to maintain security, while allowing for the practical coordination necessary for ongoing construction work. The guards needed to know the schedules and procedures of the work crews, but this information had to be shared in ways that didn't compromise either the security of the sites or the safety of the workers themselves. Formal meetings between watchmen and work supervisors were held regularly to discuss any security concerns, changes in construction schedules, or unusual observations that might affect the safety of the projects. These meetings were conducted with considerable formality and discretion, often in locations away from the tomb sites themselves, to prevent any unauthorized individuals from overhearing sensitive information. The compensation provided to the night watchmen reflected both the importance of their duties and the hardships associated with their work. In addition to regular wages paid in grain and other staples, the guards received special allocations of high-quality food, warm clothing for the cool desert nights, and medical care when needed. These benefits helped ensure that capable men would be willing to accept the demanding responsibilities of night watch duty. The social status of the watchmen within the broader community of tomb builders was considerable, reflecting the trust placed in them and the critical nature of their work. While they were not priests or high-ranking officials, they were respected as skilled professionals whose expertise was essential to the success of the royal burial projects. This respect extended to their families, who were also honored for their sacrifice in supporting the men who protected Egypt's most sacred sites. As Amenhotep continued his patrol through this chapter of the night, he reflected on the strength that came from being part of this brotherhood of guardians. Each man who had served before him had contributed to the accumulated knowledge and tradition that made the night watch effective, and each current watchman would, in turn, pass this heritage on to future generations of guards. The solitude of his individual patrol was balanced by the knowledge that he was part of something larger and more enduring than any single night's duty. In the deep hours of the night, when the Valley of the Kings lay wrapped in darkness, broken only by the cold light of distant stars, Amenhotep had learned to read a language that few others could understand, the subtle vocabulary of shadows and silence that revealed the true nature of the sacred valley after the sun had set. This was knowledge that could not be taught from scrolls or spoken instruction, but had to be acquired through years of patient observation and careful attention to details that the untrained eye would never notice. Shadows in the valley were never simply areas of darkness. Each shadow had its own character, its own depth and texture, determined by the source of light that created it, the surface on which it fell, and the objects that shaped its boundaries. The pale light of the stars created shadows that were soft and indistinct, blending gradually from lighter to darker areas without sharp edges. These starlight shadows could conceal much, but they also revealed subtle movements and changes that would be invisible in complete darkness. The light of the moon, when it was visible above the valley's rim, created an entirely different landscape of shadow and illumination. Moonlight shadows were sharper and more defined, casting the valley's rocky terrain into dramatic contrasts of silver light and deep black darkness. On nights when the moon was full, Amenhotep could see clearly for considerable distances, but the bright illumination also meant that his own movements would be more visible to any potential intruders who might be watching. The flickering light of his patrol lamp created a constantly changing pattern of shadows that moved with him as he walked. These mobile shadows could be both helpful and dangerous. Helpful because they revealed details of the terrain and potential hiding places. Dangerous because their movements could alert distant observers to his presence. Learning to use the lamp's light effectively required understanding how different angles and distances would affect the shadows it cast. Each type of rock surface in the valley reflected and absorbed light differently, creating distinctive shadow patterns that Amenhotep had learned to recognize and interpret. The smooth limestone of the tomb entrances created clean, sharp-edged shadows that revealed even small disturbances in their surfaces. The rougher, weathered stone of the valley walls cast more complex shadow patterns that could conceal irregularities, but also provided more reference points for detecting changes. The accumulated debris that covered much of the valley through centuries of rockfall, erosion, and the carefully arranged waste from tomb excavations created a constantly changing landscape of small shadows and hidden spaces. Amenhotep had memorized the normal patterns of this debris field, noting the positions of significant rocks, the shapes of natural depressions, and the subtle pathways that wound between obstacles. Any change in these familiar patterns required investigation. Silence, like shadow, was not simply the absence of sound, but a complex phenomenon with its own variations and meanings. The valley's nighttime silence was never complete. There was always some sound, whether from wind moving through rock crevices, the distant call of night-hunting animals, or the subtle settling sounds that stone makes as it cools from the day's heat. Understanding the normal sounds of the valley was essential to detecting the abnormal sounds that might indicate danger. The quality of silence changed with weather conditions, seasonal variations, and even the time of night. Still air on clear nights created a different acoustic environment than moving air or humid conditions. Amenhotep had learned to adjust his listening techniques based on these environmental factors, knowing that sounds would carry differently under different conditions, and that his own ability to hear subtle noises would be affected by factors such as air temperature and humidity. Distance altered both the intensity and character of sounds in ways that could be used to locate their sources and estimate their significance. Footsteps that might be clearly audible when close became subtle rhythmic vibrations when heard from farther away. Voices carried differently depending on their direction, with conversations echoing differently when they originated from within tomb passages than when they came from the open valley floor. The valley's complex topography created acoustic effects that could both aid and confuse the watchman's efforts to locate and identify sounds. Conversations could be funneled along narrow passages between rock formations, making them audible at considerable distances while masking their exact source. Sounds could also be reflected off cliff faces, creating false echoes that seemed to come from entirely different directions than their actual origins. Learning to identify the sources of night sounds required extensive experience and careful attention to subtle details that distinguished one type of sound from another. The footsteps of different animals could be identified not just by their rhythm and intensity, but by the specific sounds they made against different types of ground surface. Human footsteps had their own distinctive characteristics, particularly the sounds made by sandals or bare feet against stone, which were quite different from the sounds of animal movement. The sounds made by inanimate objects, wind-blown debris, settling stones, thermal expansion and contraction of rock formed a constant background that had to be understood and filtered out in order to detect the sounds that might indicate human activity. These natural sounds followed predictable patterns based on temperature changes, wind conditions, and the structural characteristics of the rock formations, allowing experienced watchmen to distinguish between innocent environmental sounds and potentially significant disturbances. Breathing and heartbeat, both his own and those of potential intruders, became significant factors in the acoustic landscape of night patrol. Amenhotep had learned to control his own breathing to minimize the sound it made, and to listen for the breathing of others who might be concealed nearby. Heavy breathing, rapid breathing, or the attempted suppression of breathing sounds could all indicate the presence of unauthorized individuals. The technique of listening at tomb entrances required particular skill interpreting the sounds that emerged from the underground chambers. Air movement through the tunnels created subtle background sounds that changed with temperature differences and barometric pressure. These normal sounds had to be distinguished from the sounds of human activity, footsteps in the passages, the scrape of tools against stone, or the muffled conversation of intruders working in the deeper chambers. Scent, while not directly part of the language of shadows and silence, was closely related to both and provided additional information that could supplement visual and auditory observations. The desert air was normally clean and dry, carrying only the subtle scents of stone, sparse vegetation, and occasional traces of smoke from distant fires. Any unusual scent, human perspiration, lamp oil, food, or the distinctive odor of bronze implements could indicate the presence of intruders or the disturbance of cached materials. The movement of air through the valley created its own patterns that affected both shadows and sounds. Gentle breezes could stir dust and small debris, creating movement that might be mistaken for human activity if not properly understood. But these same air currents could also carry scents and sounds from considerable distances, providing early warning of approaching individuals long before they could be seen or heard directly. Temperature differences within the valley created microenvironments that affected how shadows fell and how sounds carried. Areas that had been in sunlight during the day retained heat longer and created rising air currents that could distort both visual observations and acoustic phenomena. Cooler areas, particularly those that had been shaded throughout the day, provided different conditions for both concealment and detection. The interaction between natural and artificial light sources created complex shadow patterns that required careful interpretation. When Amenhotep's lamp was the only source of illumination, the shadows it cast were predictable and easy to understand. But if there were other light sources in the valley, whether from other watchmen, from intruders carrying their own lights, or from fires burning in the distant workers' village, the interaction of multiple light sources could create confusing and misleading shadow patterns. Reflections from polished surfaces added another layer of complexity to the nighttime visual environment. Bronze implements, polished stone surfaces, and even pools of water could reflect and redirect light in ways that created false impressions of movement or illumination where none actually existed. Understanding these reflection patterns was important both for accurate observation and for avoiding the false alarms that could result from misinterpreting reflected light. The seasonal movement of stars and constellations provided a slowly changing backdrop that affected the overall lighting conditions in the valley throughout the night and throughout the year. Amenhotep had learned to use these celestial patterns not only for timekeeping, but also as reference points for understanding how the changing positions of stars would affect the visibility of different areas within his patrol route. Memory played a crucial role in interpreting the language of shadows and silence. Each night's patrol added to Amenhotep's accumulated knowledge of normal conditions, building a detailed mental map of how the valley should look, sound, and feel under different circumstances. This baseline of normal conditions made it possible to detect even subtle changes that might indicate suspicious activity. The psychological aspects of interpreting shadows and silence were as important as the physical techniques. Fear, fatigue, and anxiety could all affect perception, causing innocent shadows to appear threatening or normal sounds to seem suspicious. Maintaining mental calm and objectivity was essential to accurate observation and appropriate response to potential threats. As this chapter of his night watch continued, Amenhotep reflected on how completely he had internalized this complex language of the valley's darkness. What had once required conscious effort and careful thought had become as natural as breathing, allowing him to move through the night landscape with confidence and effectiveness, reading its subtle messages and responding appropriately to both its reassurances and its warnings. The implements that accompanied Amenhotep on his nightly patrols were far more than simple tools. They were carefully chosen instruments that had been refined through generations of night watchmen, each serving multiple purposes and embodying the accumulated wisdom of those who had walked these paths before him. Every item he carried had been selected not only for its practical utility, but also for its ability to function silently and effectively in the unique environment of the Valley of the Kings after dark. His patrol lamp, seemingly simple in its construction, represented perhaps the most sophisticated piece of equipment in his possession. The pottery vessel that formed its body had been crafted by artisans who specialized in creating containers for night work, using clay that had been mixed with crushed limestone to prevent cracking from rapid temperature changes. The shape was carefully designed to provide stable light while minimizing the visibility of the flame from a distance, with a narrowed opening that focused the illumination downward while preventing the light from spreading widely enough to be seen by distant observers. The wick holder within the lamp was made of bronze, shaped to position the flame at precisely the right height and angle for optimal illumination, while consuming oil at the most efficient rate. The bronze was treated with a thin coating of beeswax to prevent corrosion from the lamp oil and to reduce any reflective glints that might catch unwanted attention. Even the choice of metal for this component reflected careful consideration. Bronze provided better heat conduction than copper, ensuring even burning, while being less expensive than silver or gold. The oil used in the lamp was itself a carefully prepared mixture that balanced several competing requirements. Pure sesame oil burned cleanly and provided steady illumination, but it was expensive and sometimes difficult to obtain in sufficient quantities. Animal fat, while less expensive and more readily available, could produce smoke and unpleasant odors that might alert potential intruders. The final mixture used by the watchmen combined sesame oil with rendered sheep fat and small amounts of aromatic resins that helped mask any human scent while providing a pleasant, subtle fragrance. The wick material was prepared from the finest linen fibers, carefully twisted to create the proper density for steady burning without excessive smoke. The length of the wick protruding from the oil reservoir was critical to short, and the flame would be weak and prone to extinguishing in even light breezes. Too long and it would burn too brightly, consume oil wastefully, and produce telltale smoke. Amenhotep carried spare wick material wrapped in oiled leather, allowing him to adjust or replace the wick if necessary during his patrol. The wooden staff that accompanied him on every patrol was carved from imported hardwood, selected for its combination of strength, weight, and acoustic properties. The wood came from the mountains to the south, where trees grew dense and hard from the challenging growing conditions. This particular piece had been seasoned for several years before being carved, ensuring that it would not crack or warp with age and use. The staff's length reaching from the ground to Amenhotep's shoulder when he stood upright was precisely calculated for multiple functions. As a walking aid, it provided stability on uncertain terrain and could be used to test the firmness of suspicious surfaces before committing his full weight to them. As a weapon, it was long enough to keep potential attackers at a safe distance, while remaining maneuverable in the confined spaces of tomb entrances and narrow passages between rocks. But the staff's most sophisticated function was as an acoustic instrument. When placed against rock walls, tomb entrances, or other solid surfaces, it transmitted vibrations and subtle sounds that might otherwise be undetectable. The density and grain structure of the hardwood made it an excellent conductor of mechanical vibrations, allowing Amenhotep to listen through stone walls and sealed entrances with remarkable sensitivity. The staff was also carved with a series of small notches and ridges that served as tactile references in complete darkness. By running his fingers along these markings, Amenhotep could gauge distances, identify specific locations, and even communicate simple messages to other watchmen who might examine the staff in his absence. These markings were carved in a pattern that would appear decorative to casual observers, but conveyed specific information to those who understood their meaning. The leather water container that Amenhotep carried represented another example of specialized design adapted to the requirements of night patrol. The leather was treated with resins and oils that made it both waterproof and relatively odorless, preventing the container from developing the strong smell that untreated leather could acquire when repeatedly wetted and dried. The size was carefully calculated to hold sufficient water for an entire night's patrol, while remaining light enough to carry comfortably for extended periods. The water itself was not simply drawn from the nearest convenient source, but was specially prepared for night watch duty. It was filtered through clean sand and charcoal to remove any impurities that might cause illness or create strong tastes or odors. Small amounts of mint or other aromatic herbs were sometimes added, not for flavor, but to help mask the scent of the leather container and to provide a subtle freshening effect that could help maintain alertness during the long hours of darkness. The food carried during night patrol was selected according to criteria that prioritized silence, portability, and nutritional value, while avoiding anything that might create unwanted odors or attract animal attention. Dried dates provided quick energy and natural sweetness, while producing minimal sound when eaten. Barley cakes, prepared without salt to prevent thirst, offered more substantial nutrition and could be consumed quietly even in situations requiring complete silence. These food items were wrapped in clean linen cloth that had been treated with beeswax to provide moisture protection while preventing rustling sounds that might compromise stealth. The wrapping technique itself was specialized, using methods that allowed quick, silent access to the food, while ensuring that the protective covering could be restored without creating noise or leaving traces that might alert observers to the watchman's presence. The clothing worn during night patrol reflected generations of refinement in materials and design. The linen tunic was woven from the finest fibers available, creating a garment that was both durable and nearly silent in movement. The weave pattern was specifically chosen to minimize the friction sounds that coarser fabrics might produce when moving against themselves or against other surfaces. The color of the night watch clothing was carefully chosen to provide optimal concealment in the valley's varied lighting conditions. Rather than simple black, which could appear unnaturally dark against the lighter stone surfaces, the fabric was dyed in muted earth tones that would blend with the rocky terrain under different lighting conditions. The dyes themselves were prepared using local materials, ensuring that the colors would be appropriate for the specific environment of the valley. The sandals worn during patrol were perhaps the most specialized items of personal equipment. The leather was selected from animals that had been raised specifically for this purpose, ensuring consistent thickness and flexibility. The sawless were designed with a subtle tread pattern that provided grip on smooth stone surfaces, while minimizing the sound of footsteps on both hard and soft ground. The fastenings of the sandals were designed to be completely secure while remaining adjustable for different terrain and conditions. Loose or inadequate fastenings could create noise or cause stumbling at critical moments, while overly tight fastenings could impair circulation with the long hours of patrol. The leather straps were treated with oils that kept them supple and prevented the cracking that could develop from repeated exposure to the desert's extreme temperature variations. Small pouches and containers attached to Amenhotep's belt held various specialized items that might be needed during the course of a night's patrol. A small bronze knife, kept sharp and clean, served multiple purposes, from cutting food to creating emergency signals by striking against stone surfaces. A length of strong cord, woven from linen fibers and treated with beeswax for durability, could be used for climbing, securing objects, or restraining captured intruders. A small bronze mirror, polished to a bright reflective surface, was essential for the signal system that allowed communication between widely separated watchmen. The mirror was sized to be easily concealed while providing sufficient reflective area to cast visible light signals across the valley's considerable distances. It was protected by a soft leather cover that prevented scratches while eliminating any accidental reflections that might compromise the watchman's concealment. Emergency supplies included materials for basic first aid, fire starting, and temporary shelter construction. These items were carefully selected for their versatility and compact size, as space and weight were significant considerations during the long hours of patrol. Bandages made from clean linen could serve for wound care or emergency repairs to equipment. Flints and steel provided reliable fire-starting capability, while tinder prepared from dried plant fibers ensured that emergency fires could be started quickly and efficiently. The bronze instruments used for various patrol tasks were crafted by skilled metal workers who understood the specific requirements of night watch duty. These implements were designed to function silently, with smooth surfaces that wouldn't scrape against stone or create metallic sounds that could alert intruders. The bronze itself was alloyed to provide the optimal balance of strength, durability, and workability, using proportions of copper and tin that had been refined through generations of trial and refinement. Maintenance of these tools and implements was a crucial aspect of effective night watch duty. Each piece of equipment required regular attention to ensure that it would function properly when needed. The lamp had to be cleaned regularly to prevent the buildup of carbon deposits that could affect the quality of its light. The staff required periodic treatment with oils to maintain its acoustic properties and prevent cracking from the desert's dry conditions. The psychological importance of well-maintained, reliable equipment extended far beyond its practical utility. Knowing that his tools would function properly when needed provided Amenhotep with confidence and peace of mind that were essential for effective performance during stressful situations. The ritual of maintaining and preparing his equipment also served as a form of meditation, helping him focus his mind and prepare mentally for the challenges of the night ahead. As this chapter of his patrol continued, Amenhotep reflected on how completely these tools had become extensions of himself, each one familiar to his hands and integrated into his techniques for moving through the night landscape. The lamp provided not just illumination but confidence. The staff offered not just support but security, and all the smaller implements contributed to his ability to function effectively as a guardian of the valley's sacred sites. The transition from day to night in the Valley of the Kings marked more than just a change in it. It represented a complete transformation in the nature and purpose of human activity within this sacred space. As the last of the construction workers completed their daily tasks and began the journey back to their village homes, a different kind of work began, one that would continue through all the hours of darkness until the first light of dawn brought the return of the day shift. The evening changeover between day workers and night watchmen followed carefully established protocols that ensured continuous security while minimizing the risk of confusion or gaps in coverage. As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, casting the valley into the long shadows that preceded full darkness, the construction supervisors would begin the process of securing their work sites and accounting for all personnel, tools, and materials. Each active tomb site had its own specific shutdown procedure that had been developed through years of experience and refined to address the particular challenges of that location. Tools were collected and stored in predetermined locations. Work materials were secured against both theft and weather damage, and the entrances to tunnels and chambers were sealed with combinations of stone barriers and wooden frameworks that would reveal any unauthorized disturbance. The day shift foreman would conduct final inspections of their work areas, checking that all valuable materials had been properly secured and that no tools or equipment had been accidentally left in locations where they might attract the attention of potential intruders. These inspections were thorough and methodical, as the loss of even simple implements could seriously disrupt the following day's work schedule and jeopardize the timely completion of tomb construction projects. As darkness approached, the first of the night watchmen would begin to arrive at their assigned positions throughout the valley. This transition period was carefully coordinated to ensure that no area was left unguarded even briefly, with overlapping schedules that provided continuous coverage during the changeover. The incoming watchman would receive briefings from the departing day supervisors about any unusual observations, changes in construction schedules, or security concerns that had developed during the daylight hours. Amenhotep's arrival at the watchman's headquarters shelter marked the beginning of his own preparation ritual, a sequence of activities that helped him transition mentally from his daytime activities to the focused alertness required for effective night patrol. This preparation was both practical and psychological, serving to organize his equipment and supplies while also focusing his mind on the challenges and responsibilities that lay ahead. The shelter itself was a simple but well-designed structure that served multiple functions for the night watch operations. Built into a natural depression in the valley wall, it was concealed from casual observation while providing commanding views of the primary tomb sites and approach routes. The interior was organized with careful attention to functionality, providing storage for equipment and supplies while offering protection from the weather during the brief rest periods that punctuated the long hours of patrol. Weather conditions played a significant role determining the specific procedures and priorities for each night's watch. Clear, calm nights allowed for comprehensive patrols of all tomb sites and approach routes, with detailed inspections that might reveal even subtle signs of disturbance. But windy nights required different strategies, with guards concentrating on the most critical sites while adapting their techniques to account for reduced visibility and the masking effects of wind noise. The rare nights when storms threatened brought their own unique challenges and opportunities. The approach of bad weather often drove potential intruders to accelerate their activities, attempting to complete their illegal work before conditions became too difficult. But storms also provided natural concealment for the watchman's activities, allowing for movement and positioning that would be impossible under normal conditions. Rain, though infrequent in the desert environment, created both problems and advantages for the night watch. While it made patrol routes treacherous and reduced visibility, it also washed away tracks and disturbances, forcing any tomb robbers to leave fresh signs of their activities that would be easily detectable once the weather cleared. The watchman had developed specific procedures for post-rain inspections that took advantage of these changed conditions. The coordination between different watchmen assigned to various sectors of the valley required careful planning and regular communication throughout the night. While each guard had primary responsibility for specific tomb sites, the overall security of the area depended on cooperation and mutual support among all the men on duty. This cooperation was maintained through a combination of scheduled meetings at predetermined checkpoints and emergency signal systems that could summon assistance when needed. The checkpoint meetings served multiple purposes beyond simple coordination. They provided opportunities for watchmen to share information about unusual observations, changes in patrol routes necessitated by construction activities, and updates on security procedures that might affect their duties. These meetings also served a psychological function, offering brief periods of human contact that helped combat the isolation and stress of solitary patrol duty. Emergency signal procedures were designed to balance the need for rapid communication with the requirement for maintaining stealth and avoiding detection by potential intruders. The bronze mirrors used for long-distance signaling were supplemented by sound signal-specific patterns of whistle calls or staff tapping against stone surfaces that could convey urgent information without alerting unauthorized listeners to the nature of the communication. The night shift also included personnel beyond the roving watchmen who conducted the mobile patrols. Fixed guard positions were maintained at the most critical locations, with guards stationed at concealed observation posts that provided overlapping fields of view, covering all the major approach routes to the tomb sites. These stationary guards served as anchors for the overall security system, providing stable reference points for the mobile patrols while maintaining continuous observation of the most vulnerable areas. The stationary guards faced different challenges than their mobile counterparts, remaining motionless for extended periods while maintaining alertness required considerable discipline and mental training. These guards had developed techniques for staying alert during long periods of observation, including systematic scanning patterns that ensured complete coverage of their assigned areas and mental exercises that helped maintain focus during the monotonous hours of unchanging watch. Communication between the fixed positions and the mobile patrols was maintained through subtle visual signals that would be invisible to distant observers, but clearly readable to those who knew what to look for. Small adjustments in the positioning of equipment, changes in posture, or the direction of orientation could all convey specific information about the status of different areas or the movement of potential threats. The supply system that supported the night watch operations was a complex logistical enterprise that had to function efficiently while remaining completely invisible to potential intruders. Water, food, lamp oil, and other necessities had to be delivered to cache points throughout the valley and maintained in condition for immediate use when needed. This supply network included not only the materials needed by the watchmen themselves, but also emergency supplies that might be required if tomb robbers were discovered and had to be pursued or contained until daylight brought reinforcements. The cache locations were carefully chosen and ingeniously concealed, often taking advantage of natural features or existing construction work to hide supply containers in places where they would never be discovered by casual observation. Some caches were hidden within the waste piles from tomb excavations, their containers buried beneath carefully arranged stones that appeared completely natural. Others were concealed within ventilation shafts or unused passages in the older tomb sites, taking advantage of spaces that served no current construction purpose but remained accessible to authorized personnel. The maintenance and replenishment of these supply caches was a continuous process that required careful coordination with the day shift operations. New supplies had to be delivered and old materials replaced without attracting attention or disrupting the work activities that continued during daylight hours. This resupply work was often conducted during the transitional periods at dawn and dusk, when the changing activities in the valley provided natural cover for these logistical operations. The record-keeping associated with the night watch was minimal but essential, focusing on information that would be critical for maintaining security while avoiding the creation of documents that might fall into unauthorized hands and reveal security procedures or patrol schedules. Simple marks scratched into stone surfaces at the watchman's headquarters recorded the basic facts about each night's watch, which guards were on duty, which areas had been patrolled, and any unusual observations that might be relevant to future security planning. These records served multiple purposes, providing information that could help identify patterns in potential threat activities, while also serving as a form of accountability system that ensured all assigned duties had been properly fulfilled. The record-keeping system was designed to be meaningful to authorized personnel while remaining cryptic enough to be useless to anyone who might gain unauthorized access to the information. The relationship between the night watch and the broader security apparatus protecting the royal burial projects extended far beyond the immediate confines of the valley itself. The watchmen were part of a larger network that included guards at the workers' village, patrols along the approach routes from the Nile, and security personnel at the administrative centers where tomb construction was planned and supervised. Information flowed through this security network in carefully controlled ways, with each level of personnel receiving only the information necessary for their specific responsibilities. The night watchmen, while critical to the immediate security of the tomb sites, were not privy to broader intelligence about potential threats or the political considerations that influence security planning. This compartmentalization of information helped ensure that the compromise of any single element of the security system would not endanger the entire operation. The training and preparation of replacement personnel was an ongoing concern that had to be balanced against the need for maintaining security and the practical limitations of the resources available for this purpose. New watchmen had to be selected carefully, trained thoroughly, and integrated into the existing teams without disrupting the established routines and procedures that had proven effective over years of operation. The training process for new watchmen was extensive and gradual, beginning with basic familiarization with the valley's geography and the general principles of security work before progressing to more specialized skills such as night navigation, threat detection, and emergency response procedures. This training was conducted primarily during daylight hours, using simulation exercises and theoretical instruction to prepare new guards for the realities of night duty without compromising actual security operations. The psychological preparation of new watchmen was as important as their technical training, as the stresses and challenges of night watch duty could be considerable. The isolation of solitary patrol, the constant need for alertness, and the awareness of the serious consequences of security failures all created pressures that had to be addressed through proper preparation and ongoing support from experienced colleagues. Veteran watchmen like Amenhotep played crucial roles in this training process, serving as mentors and guides for newer personnel while continuing to fulfill their own operational responsibilities. This mentoring relationship was formalized through assignments that paired experienced guards with trainees, but it also extended to informal support and guidance that helped new watchmen adapt to the unique demands of their duties. As this chapter of the Night's Watch continued, Amenhotep reflected on the remarkable complexity and effectiveness of the system of which he was part. Each element of the night shift operations, from the individual techniques of silent movement to the coordinated activities of multiple guards, contributed to a security apparatus that had protected the valley's sacred sites for generations and would, with continued vigilance and dedication, continue to safeguard them for generations to come. Not every night in the Valley of the Kings passed without incident, and over the years of his service, Amenhotep had accumulated a collection of encounters that ranged from the merely unusual to the genuinely dangerous. These experiences had shaped his understanding of both the threats that faced the sacred tombs and the techniques required to deal effectively with those who would dare to disturb the eternal rest of the pharaohs. The most common intruders were not the organized tomb robbers that the security system was primarily designed to counter, but rather individual scavengers and opportunists who hoped to find valuable materials or tools that had been carelessly left unguarded. These casual thieves, while less dangerous than professional robbers, still posed significant threats to the construction projects and required careful handling to prevent them from escalating into more serious problems. One such encounter had occurred during Amenhotep's third year of service, when he had discovered a young man from the workers' village attempting to remove bronze chisels from a tool cache near the tomb of Ramesses IX. The intruder had been inexperienced and poorly prepared, carrying only a simple torch and lacking any understanding of the valley's security arrangements. His amateur approach had made detection easy, but the situation had required delicate handling to avoid creating larger problems. The young thief had been terrified when confronted, clearly understanding the severe penalties that awaited anyone caught stealing from the tomb construction sites. Rather than attempting to flee or resist, he had immediately collapsed to his knees and begged for mercy, claiming that his family was hungry and that he had only intended to take enough tools to trade for food. His obvious inexperience and genuine distress had indicated that this was likely a case of desperate opportunism rather than organized criminal activity. Amenhotep's handling of this situation had required balancing several competing considerations. The theft attempt was serious and could not be ignored, as doing so might encourage others to make similar attempts. But the young man's obvious inexperience and family connections to the legitimate workforce suggested that harsh punishment might create more problems than it solved, potentially turning a loyal worker's family against the tomb construction projects. The resolution had involved a combination of immediate deterrence and longer-term prevention. The would-be thief had been detained and questioned thoroughly to ensure that he was acting alone and had no connections to more organized criminal activity. Once his amateur status had been confirmed, he had been released with a severe warning, and arrangements had been made to provide his family with additional food allocations to address the desperation that had motivated his attempted theft. More serious encounters had involved professional tomb robbers who possessed both the skills and equipment necessary to pose genuine threats to the security of the burial sites. These individuals or groups typically approached their illegal activities with careful planning and considerable knowledge of tomb construction techniques, security procedures, and the layout of the valley itself. One particularly memorable incident had involved a group of 3 experienced robbers who had attempted to gain access to the tomb of Seti I through one of the ventilation shafts that provided air circulation to the deep chambers. Their plan had been sophisticated and well researched, involving detailed knowledge of the tomb's internal layout and the timing of guard patrols. They had even brought specialized equipment including ropes, bronze tools, and a pulley system for removing heavy objects through the narrow shaft. The discovery of this intrusion attempt had come not through direct observation, but through the subtle signs that experienced watchmen learned to recognize. Small disturbances in the carefully arranged stones that concealed the ventilation opening, fresh scratches on the bronze grating that sealed the shaft, and the faint scent of unfamiliar lamp oil in the air around the entrance had all indicated that unauthorized activity was taking place. The confrontation that followed had required all of Amenhotep's training and experience. The robbers, trapped in the narrow ventilation shaft when their presence was discovered, had initially attempted to negotiate their way out of the situation. When this proved unsuccessful, they had resorted to threats and finally to violence, using their bronze tools as weapons in a desperate attempt to fight their way to freedom. The confined space of the ventilation shaft had worked both for and against the defenders. While it prevented the robbers from using their numerical advantage effectively, it also made it difficult for the guards to bring their own numbers to bear in subduing the intruders. The battle had been fought largely with wooden staffs and bronze implements in a space barely wide enough for a single person, making it as much a test of endurance and determination as of combat skill. The eventual resolution had come when additional guards, summoned by the emergency signals, had been able to seal both ends of the ventilation system, trapping the robbers until they could be safely extracted and turned over to the authorities for punishment. The incident had provided valuable lessons about the vulnerability of ventilation systems and had led to improvements in the security arrangements for these potential access points. Not all encounters with intruders ended in capture or confrontation. Some of the most successful aspects of the Night Watch involved deterring potential threats before they could develop into actual security breaches. The visible presence of alert guards, the obvious signs of security measures, and the reputation for vigilance that the watch force had established all served to discourage many potential intruders from even attempting to approach the tomb sites. On several occasions, Amenhotep had observed suspicious individuals reconnoitering the valley during daylight hours, obviously studying the layout and security arrangements in preparation for potential nighttime activities. These preliminary scouting activities were carefully noted and reported, leading to increased vigilance during subsequent nights and sometimes to the identification and apprehension of potential threats before they could take action. The psychological aspects of these encounters were often as important as the physical confrontations themselves. Many potential tomb robbers were motivated as much by desperation as by greed, driven to attempt dangerous illegal activities by poverty, debt, or family obligations that seemed to leave them with no alternative. Understanding these motivations was important for determining how to respond effectively to different types of threats. Professional criminals, motivated primarily by profit, required different handling than desperate individuals driven by immediate need. The professionals were more likely to be armed, better prepared, and more willing to use violence to achieve their goals. But they were also more likely to retreat when faced with determined opposition, as their criminal activities were business enterprises rather than desperate last resorts. Family-motivated thieves, driven by hunger or debt, were often more unpredictable in their responses to confrontation. Their desperation could make them dangerous even when they lacked professional criminal skills, as they might be willing to take risks that more calculating criminals would avoid. But their emotional motivation also made them more susceptible to appeals to reason and more likely to respond to alternatives that address their underlying problems. The seasonal patterns of intrusion attempts provided insights into the relationship between economic conditions in the broader community and the security threats facing the tomb construction projects. Attempts at theft and robbery typically increased during periods of economic hardship, such as years when Nile floods were inadequate and agricultural production suffered. Understanding these patterns helped the security force anticipate periods of increased risk and adjust their procedures accordingly. Weather conditions also influenced the timing and nature of security incidents. Stormy nights provided cover for intruders, but also made their activities more difficult and dangerous. Clear, moonless nights offered optimal conditions for unauthorized activities, while providing the best opportunities for guards to detect and intercept suspicious movements. The security force had learned to adjust their alertness levels and patrol schedules based on these environmental factors. The most challenging encounters were those that involved individuals with legitimate reasons for being in the valley, but who were present at unauthorized times or in restricted areas. Workers who had forgotten tools and returned to retrieve them after hours, supervisors conducting unofficial inspections, and even priests or officials whose presence might be authorized, but whose activities were questionable or required careful evaluation and appropriate response. These ambiguous situations demanded considerable judgment and discretion from the watchman. Challenging the wrong person could create serious political problems, while failing to investigate suspicious activities could result in security breaches with even more serious consequences. The key was developing the ability to assess quickly whether an individual's presence was legitimate, while maintaining appropriate caution until that determination could be made with confidence. Communication during encounters with potential intruders was itself a specialized skill that had to be developed through training and experience. The initial challenge had to be authoritative enough to establish control of the situation while remaining professional and avoiding unnecessary escalation. The watchmen were trained to use specific phrases and tones that would be clearly understood by both legitimate personnel and potential criminals, while maintaining appropriate dignity for representatives of the pharaoh's security force. The questioning techniques used to determine whether individuals had legitimate reasons for being in the valley were designed to verify identity and authorization without revealing security procedures or information that might be useful to potential intruders. Standard questions about work assignments, supervisor names, and current project status were supplemented by more subtle inquiries that could help distinguish between legitimate workers and individuals who had obtained their information through unauthorized means. Documentation of security incidents was minimal but important, focusing on information that would be useful for improving future security while avoiding the creation of detailed records that might compromise ongoing operations if they fell into unauthorized hands. Simple notations about the timing, location, and nature of incidents provided data for identifying patterns and trends without creating intelligence that could be used by potential adversaries. The coordination with other elements of the security system and after encounters with intruders was crucial for ensuring that threats were completely neutralized and that lessons learned could be incorporated into ongoing security procedures. Information about incidents was shared with appropriate supervisors and other security personnel, but always with careful attention to maintaining operational security and protecting the identities and methods of the guards involved. As this chapter of his patrol continued, Amenhotep remained alert for any signs that this night might bring its own encounters with those who would threaten the sacred tombs. Each shadow, each sound, each change in the familiar patterns of the night landscape herald the beginning of another test of his skills and dedication as a guardian of the pharaoh's eternal rest. The first subtle lightening of the eastern sky, not just the approaching end of another night's vigil, but the completion of a cycle as old as the valley itself, the eternal rhythm of darkness and light that governed the work of both the living and the eternal rest of the divine pharaohs. For Amenhotep, this gradual transition from night to day represented both the successful conclusion of another period of protective watch and the beginning of the careful process that would hand responsibility for the valley's security back to the day shift. The pre-dawn hours required perhaps the greatest vigilance of the entire night, as the approaching daylight created new opportunities for potential intruders, while also presenting challenges for the guards who had been working in darkness for many hours. The growing light made it easier to detect suspicious activities, but it also made the watchmen themselves more visible to any observers who might be planning unauthorized activities. As the stars began to fade against the gradually brightening sky, Amenhotep made his final comprehensive circuit of the tomb sites under his protection. This last patrol of the night was conducted with particular thoroughness, as the changing light conditions allowed for more detailed inspection of areas that might have been difficult to examine adequately in complete darkness. Fresh footprints, disturbed vegetation, or displaced stones that might have escaped notice during the night hours could now be detected and investigated. The acoustic environment of the valley also changed as dawn approached. The deep silence of the night hours gradually gave way to the first sounds of diurnal activity, birds beginning to call from the distant cliffs, the subtle sounds of small creatures stirring to life, and occasionally the distant voices of early rising workers in the village beyond the valley. These changing sound patterns required adjustments in listening techniques and attention to different types of potential threats. Temperature changes that accompanied the coming dawn created their own effects on both the physical environment and the activities of potential intruders. The cooling air of night began to give way to the first warming effects of the approaching sun, creating air currents and thermal effects that could influence how sounds carried and how scents moved through the valley's complex topography. The final inspection of each tomb site followed established procedures that had been refined through years of experience. Each sealed entrance was examined for any signs of tampering. The concealing arrangements of stones and debris were checked to ensure they remained undisturbed, and the various supply caches and security installations were verified to be intact and properly secured. At the tomb of Ramesses VII, where construction work was progressing rapidly, Amenhotep paid particular attention to the entrance area, where fresh excavation work had created loose stone and unstable surfaces that might show signs of unauthorized passage. The limestone chips and dust that surrounded the entrance were examined for footprints or other disturbances, and the wooden framework that protected the entrance overnight was inspected for any signs of interference. The tomb of Seti I, with its complex network of passages and chambers, required more extensive final inspection. Amenhotep descended into the upper levels of the excavation, his lamp casting familiar shadows on the painted walls as he listened for any sounds from the deeper chambers and checked the various side passages and storage areas for signs of intrusion. The growing daylight streaming down through the entrance passages created dramatic effects as it mixed with the artificial illumination of his lamp. The painted figures on the walls seemed to come alive in this transitional lighting, their colors gaining richness and depth as the combination of flame and natural light revealed details that were invisible under either illumination alone. Water levels in the storage containers scattered throughout the valley were checked and recorded, both as a security measure and as preparation for the day's work activities. These pottery jars, essential for the construction work, were also attractive targets for casual thieves, and their contents had to be verified as part of the overall security assessment. The signaling mirrors used for communication between guard positions were cleaned and properly positioned for potential use during the day, though their primary function was for night operations. These bronze implements, polished to high reflectivity, could also serve emergency communication needs during daylight hours if unusual circumstances required coordination between different areas of the valley. As the eastern horizon began to show the first definitive signs of approaching sunrise, the process of transitioning responsibility to the day shift began in earnest. This handover was conducted with careful attention to ensuring continuous security coverage, while efficiently communicating any significant observations or concerns from the night's patrol. The day shift supervisors, arriving as the first rays of sunlight touched the tops of the valley's eastern walls, would receive detailed briefings about the night's activities. These reports focused on any unusual observations, changes in the condition of tomb sites or equipment, and any security concerns that might affect the day's construction activities. The Watchman's headquarters shelter served as the coordination point for this transition, providing a secure location where information could be shared and final preparations could be made for the day's activities. Maps and diagrams kept at the shelter were updated with any new information discovered during the night, ensuring that the accumulated knowledge about the valley's security situation remained current and accurate. Personal equipment used during the night patrol was cleaned, inspected, and prepared for storage until the next night's duty. The patrol lamp was extinguished and cleaned, its oil reservoir emptied, and wiped clean to prevent the accumulation of residue that could affect future performance. The wick was trimmed and stored properly to ensure that it would be ready for immediate use when needed again. The wooden staff, having served faithfully throughout another night's patrol, was examined for any damage or wear that might have occurred during the night's activities. The acoustic properties that made it so valuable for detecting sounds through stone walls were verified to be unchanged, and the tactile reference marks were checked to ensure they remained clear and accurate. Food and water supplies were inventoried and replenished as necessary, with any unused provisions being properly stored to prevent spoilage or contamination. The leather containers and wrapping materials were cleaned and prepared for reuse, maintaining the high standards of cleanliness and reliability that were essential for effective night operations. The transition period also provided opportunities for brief rest and refreshment before the complete changeover to day shift responsibility. This was not simply physical recovery from the night's exertions, but also psychological preparation for returning to normal daytime activities after hours of intense alertness and vigilance. Personal hygiene and grooming were attended to with care, both as practical necessities and as expressions of the dignity and professionalism that characterized the Valley's security force. Clean clothing, properly groomed hair and beards, and attention to overall appearance reflected the respect owed to the sacred nature of their duties and the divine pharaohs they served to protect. The sunrise itself, when it finally crested the eastern walls of the valley, marked the official end of the night watch and the beginning of another day's construction activities. The first rays of direct sunlight transformed the valley from the mysterious landscape of shadows and whispers that had characterized the night hours into the bustling workplace, where hundreds of skilled artisans would soon resume their labors on the eternal resting places of Egypt's divine kings. The sounds of approaching day, workers began to echo from the paths leading into the valley, voices in conversation, the footsteps of sandaled feet against stone, and the various sounds of tools and materials being transported to the construction sites. These familiar sounds provided reassurance that another night had passed successfully, and that the sacred work of creating the royal tombs would continue without interruption. Final security checks were conducted as the day shift took over responsibility for protecting the valley and its precious contents. Keys were transferred, guard positions were assumed by fresh personnel, and the various security systems were tested to ensure proper functioning under day shift control. The night watchmen, their duties successfully completed for another cycle, would make their way back to the workers' village where rest, food, and the company of families awaited them. But even as they departed from active duty, their knowledge and experience remained part of the valley's defenses, ready to be called upon again when darkness once more settled over the sacred tombs. The continuity between night and day operations was seamless and professional, reflecting the high standards and careful organization that characterized all aspects of the royal tomb construction projects. Each shift built upon the work and vigilance of the other, creating an unbroken chain of protection that ensured the security of the pharaoh's eternal resting places. As Amenhotep completed his final duties and prepared to depart from the valley, he reflected on the satisfaction that came from another successful night of service. The tombs remained secure, the construction work could continue without interruption, and the divine pharaohs could rest assured that their eternal journeys through the afterlife would not be disturbed by the greed or desperation of those who would violate their sacred spaces. The cycle would begin again with the coming of darkness, when new challenges and responsibilities would call the night watchmen back to their posts. But for now, as the sun climbed higher in the clear desert sky and the valley came alive with the sounds of honest labor, there was the quiet satisfaction of duty faithfully performed and sacred trust properly maintained. The Valley of the Kings, guardian of Egypt's greatest secrets and protector of its most precious treasures, would continue its eternal watch over the divine pharaohs, protected by the vigilance of mortal men who understood the sacred nature of their responsibility. In the endless cycle of day and night, of construction and protection, of vigilance and rest, the great work of ensuring royal immortality continued, as constant and reliable as the rising and setting of the sun over the timeless Egyptian deserts. The night watch had ended, but its vigilance lived on in the security of the sacred sites, the safety of the construction workers, and the unbroken chain of protection that ensured the pharaoh's eternal rest would remain undisturbed for all the ages to come.